In Episode 1 of the Chronic Pain Survival Guide, I made it clear that the government's own statistics show that around 5,000 people die each year from an overdose on a legitimately prescribed opioid pain medication. In comparison, the Institutes of Medicine, the IOM, estimates there are more than 2 million serious adverse drug reactions, ADRs, in hospitalized patients every year. These reactions cause over 106,000 deaths annually, and fatal drug reactions are the fourth leading cause of death in the United States, ahead of pulmonary disease, diabetes, AIDS, pneumonia, accidents, automobile deaths, and you got it, fatal drug overdoses. It seems that when you get 60% of America hooked on medications with dangerous side effects and potential adverse drug reactions, you have to be prepared for over 100,000 deaths per year due to fatal drug reactions. It is also estimated that over 350,000 ADRs occur in U.S. nursing homes each year. Suddenly, the 5,000 overdose deaths due to legitimately prescribed opioids seems like a drop in the bucket. But all we hear about in the media is the opioid epidemic. We never hear about the risks of polypharmacy, which kills over 20 times the patients as legitimately prescribed opioids each year. But there is something else to consider. Countless diverted opioids have found their way into the black market, where they are actually abused for non-medical reasons. On May 29, 2018, the New York Times reported, Purdue Pharma, the company that planted the seeds of the opioid epidemic through its aggressive marketing of OxyContin, has claimed it was unaware of the powerful opioid painkiller's growing abuse until years after it went on the market. But a copy of a confidential Justice Department report shows that federal prosecutors investigating the company found that Purdue Pharma knew about significant abuse of OxyContin in the first years after the drug's introduction in 1996, and the pharmaceutical company concealed that information. Company officials had received reports that pills were being crushed and snorted, stolen from pharmacies, and that some doctors were being charged with selling prescriptions according to dozens of previously undisclosed documents that offer a detailed look inside Purdue Pharma. But the drug maker continued, in the face of this knowledge, to market OxyContin as less prone to abuse and addiction than other prescription opioids, prosecutors wrote in 2006. Considering the fraudulent marketing of OxyContin, it seems counterintuitive that the evidence continues to show that less than 1% of chronic pain patients develop an opioid use disorder. President Donald Trump would have us believe that opioids of any type will turn patients into addicts in less than a week.
The power of this addiction is hard to believe. People go to the hospital for a period of a week and they come out, they're drug addicts.
On April 6, 2016, in a piece for Newsweek, Josh Bloom and Henry Miller wrote, "Addiction in pain patients is rare. Many high-quality reviews conclude that the addiction rate, even in patients who have required long-term medication for severe pain due to injury or illness, is less than 1%. Today's death toll from opioid use is largely the result of abuse, not medical use, of these drugs." The current narrative from the media and the federal government states that doctors prescribed too many opioids in the 90s and created a nation of addicts. That may be true to an extent. For example, Purdue Pharma was sending millions of pills to pharmacies located in very sparsely populated areas. There was no way the amount of opioids that Purdue was shipping could be justified, but they shipped them anyway. So I concede, that may be true to an extent, but a very small extent, because we live in a culture where the overprescribing of all types of medications is commonplace. Why would it be any different with opioids? Is it really that surprising that some patients developed an opioid use disorder? Despite the overprescribing of opioids, doctors' offices and hospitals were not churning out opioid addicts in the way it has been represented. For a taste of the media's coverage concerning opioid pain medication, Let's listen to MSNBC's Morning Joe and Governor Chris Christie in late 2017.
Heroin, remember when we were growing up, heroin is what people on the outskirts of society in the worst parts of New York City did, and that was supposed to be taken care of, and drugs got lighter, and kids were just smoking pot and and now, boom, heroin. When I say just, that's not how I feel about smoking pot. Don't even get me started on the legalization of it. I just got now my son and all my friends are gonna be angry at me.
Totally opposed. I'm with you, Joe.
But how did we jump to heroin?
I'll tell you how it started. It started in doctors' offices and hospitals and pharmaceutical companies all over this country. We consume 85% of the world's prescription opiates. 85%, we're 4% of the world's population. This is an epidemic here that was started by our physicians, by our hospitals, by our pharmaceutical companies. And that's what happened. And the fact is, if we don't get at that root of it, think about this. 4 out of every 5 heroin addicts today in America started on prescription opioids.
Man, you really have to watch these pukes. They are using careful wording to create insinuations that have a proven track record for generating public fear. This is all marketing and public relations, folks. They are not trying to protect the public from a health hazard, or they would be going after the black markets. Instead, they're on a marketing and public relations campaign against doctors, pharmacies, and drug manufacturers. When I talk about careful wording to create insinuations, I'm talking about things like, 80% of people or 4 out of 5 patients who are written a prescription for opioids become a heroin addict. Now, I understand that what they're saying is new heroin initiates first abused opioids. But when they say it over and over and over so many times, it starts to sound like 4 out of 5 people prescribed opioids become a heroin addict. I'm going to turn to the Pain News Network to explain where that bogus 4 out of 5 patients statistic comes from. According to the Pain News Network website on April 23, 2018, where does the 80% figure come from? The DEA cites the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the NIDA, as its source, while the NIDA in turn references a 2013 study by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, the SAM-HSA. The SAM-HSA pulled a decade's worth of data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health and found that 4 of 5 recent heroin initiates, or 79.5%, previously used NMPR, non-medical use of pain relievers. But the SAM-HSA study did not examine how many of those heroin users had a valid prescription for opioids. So the DEA claim about users first obtaining these drugs from their healthcare providers is untrue. The SAM-HSA also notes that the literature on transition from non-medical use of pain relievers to heroin is relatively sparse, and that the vast majority of people who abuse opioid medication never actually progress to heroin. Now I want to note, they say that the vast majority of people who abuse opioid pain medication. So that means that the vast majority of people who are prescribed opioid pain medication really never progress to heroin. See, what Christie, the DEA, the NIDA, and the SAM-HSA do not explain is how in the world 79.5% of new heroin users started with a prescription from a doctor, when in the same breath, they say that the literature shows the transition from non-medical use or abuse of pain relievers to heroin is relatively sparse. It makes no sense. I mean, which one is it? The SAM-HSA report also had no way of knowing if any of the individuals studied already used street drugs or abused prescription medications and were therefore at risk of multi-drug poisoning. Once again, the federal government is creating their narrative by twisting statistics and making outlandish insinuations. And unfortunately, the media is happy to repeat it over and over. You know, I've been an extremely severe chronic pain patient for 2 decades, In that time, I have learned that pain patients typically do not feel the euphoria that abusers of prescription medications feel. That is why it is hard for many in the chronic pain community, like myself, to understand why people would abuse opioids in the first place. What's the attraction? For many, opioids make life bearable. They are not for recreational purposes. There is no way most people in chronic pain would risk abusing or diverting their medication, because if they got caught and lost access to it, they would be right back to living in hell. No quote-unquote high is worth that, and the statistics prove it. I bring all of this up because to me, it seems the main and only casualties of this war on opioids are pain management specialists and chronic pain patients. I mean, the opioid overdoses are growing at a rate of 45% per year, despite years of massive cuts to opioid pain medication by the DEA. The illegal drug supply in this country has been poisoned with deadly fentanyl. The data showing that legitimate opioid pain medication was not the cause of the overdose crisis was already available. The federal government and the media both had access to the data, and both decided to ignore it because it destroys the current narrative that doctors, hospitals, pharmacies, and big pharma created the current opioid epidemic.
For so many opioid addicts in this country, the addiction begins with a prescription from a doctor. One of the most important ways to slow down this epidemic is to slow down those prescriptions. The CDC says the country is making some progress, but it is not enough. Opioids are still way overprescribed, and people don't realize how easy it is to get hooked.
But what's worse, some doctors are cashing in on this epidemic, prescribing addictive opioids to patients that have not only they've never examined, but in many cases they've never even met them. I mean, it's all a ruse to make money off of patients' despair.
In 2017, I went to the pain management doctor. Basically, he said, that doctors have to taper their patients down greatly on their pain medications, and we're going to have to reduce you 80%, take 80% of your pain meds away. At that time, I was so flabbergasted and walked outdoor, came home and cried, and then, started looking into why is this happening? I didn't do anything wrong.
In 2017, an estimated 72,000 people died of overdose deaths in the United States, many of them from prescription opioids. Because of that, doctors feel intense pressure to reduce prescribing of these medications. I spoke to several dozen medical professionals, and many of them told me that they're worried that if they continue prescribing opioids to their chronic pain patients, they could face repercussions. This means that many chronic pain patients, like Maria, are being cut off their medications, even when they never use them inappropriately, and they are benefiting from them.
Pain clinics across the nation have closed their doors. Their patients were shoved out into the cold with no pain medication, unmanaged pain levels, and withdrawals on the horizon. The already overwhelmed pain clinics that remained open were flooded with new patients, and it's only going to get worse. 10 years ago, pain patients outnumbered pain management specialists 30,000 to 1, and that was before the federal government's public assault on the medical community and the pharmaceutical industry. The federal government knew they could not stop the black markets. The DEA has failed to since its inception. And in the early 2000s with the OxyContin Action Plan, the focus shifted to targets that law enforcement could actually bust. Pain patients, doctors, pharmacies, and big pharma. The targets came with the added incentive of asset forfeiture, something we will discuss in one of the next few episodes. And law enforcement on all levels had new cash cows in the medical community and pharmaceutical industry. Look, there were unscrupulous doctors. There were crooked pharmacies, and there was a great deal of fraudulent behavior on the part of big pharma. I'm not saying that this didn't happen, or that there isn't a risk of drug diversion continuing to happen. But at the end of the day, the feds clearly had it all wrong. The abuse and diversion was not nearly to the levels they suggested. The feds went after their typical targets, patients and doctors, as we discuss next episode with the Harrison Act. That's when it all started. We need to start looking at the problem differently. and go after the black markets and eradicate the poisoned drug supply. We got to get